All right, in this video we want to discuss another cell type that is critically important to our adaptive immune response, and that is the T cell, or the group of cells called T cells. So let's start with some basic information about T cells, and then we'll dive into how they work and the specific roles that they play in the adaptive immune response. All right, so T cells. Again, they're critical to our immunological third line of defense. Again, that's our adaptive immune response. So without T cells, we could not learn about harmful pathogens and how to protect ourselves from them. T cells, like all of the other immune cells that we're talking about, are white blood cells. So we shouldn't lose track of that. T cells are just a specific type of white blood cell. Furthermore, T cells fall into this group of white blood cells that we call agranulocytes. Again, some white blood cells have granules in their cytoplasm. Those cells are called granulocytes, whereas some white blood cells lack those granules in their cytoplasm, and they are called agranulocytes. So T cells fall into this agranulocyte category. Furthermore, we apply another name to the types of cells like T cells, and these cells are called lymphocytes. We call them lymphocytes because they're common in the lymphatic system. So we find these cells in the lymphatic system, so we call them lymphocytes. Again, they're white blood cells, they're agranulocytes, they are also lymphocytes. T cells get their name because of where they develop in the lymphatic system. So one specific part of the lymphatic system is the thymus, and T cells specifically mature or develop in the thymus. So that's why they got the name T cells, thymus cells. All right. So again, these are lots of different ways for us to refer to T cells. At the end of the video, we'll add some additional detail. We'll see that there are several types of T cells, so we'll add some specific names near the end of the video. But what else do we need to know about T cells before we move forward? In terms of the immune cells we have talked about, or if we talk about immune cells in terms of the order in which they function in an immune response, T cells are the first cells that we're talking about that are not phagocytes. So their role in immunity is not to engulf and digest potential pathogens to destroy them. They do something else instead. So that's an important detail about T cells as we try to understand their role in immunity, is that they do not do phagocytosis. That is not their role. So let's think about what their role actually is. In order to understand T cell activity, let's think about how T cells get activated or how they mature, okay? So we'll learn a little more detail about T cells, and then we'll think about what they actually do after they are activated. So all T cells, no matter their type, begin as what we would call naive T cells. Naive means that they don't know as much yet, right? So here's an image to represent a naive T cell. T cells go through an activation process. So in order for a naive T cell to learn, to become not naive and activated, they need to be activated by APCs. So again, APCs are antigen-presenting cells. One such example of an antigen-presenting cell is a dendritic cell. And so in this zoom-in box here, we have a naive T cell that is going to learn from the antigen-presenting cell, in this case a dendritic cell, about the identity of a specific antigen. So remember, antigen-presenting cells kill a pathogen, save the unique chemical identifier of that pathogen, the antigen, and they show that antigen to T cells so that T cells can learn how to identify that antigen. So we see that happening here. The APC is holding out the antigen. The T cell is in a way touching the antigen to learn what it looks like. So again, APCs teach the T cells to recognize specific antigens. After a T cell has learned from an APC what the antigen looks like, we then have active T cells that can perform their specific functions. So next we can think about what those functions are, right? Let's think about what those functions are after adding one more detail about how T cells detect antigens. So we want to add this one detail about T cell receptors. These are a critical part of a T cell. Okay, so T cells can only function if they have their T cell receptors. And so what is a T cell receptor? So a T cell receptor is just a membrane protein that is capable of binding to or sticking to a specific antigen. So we could kind of see this molecule in the figure on the last slide, but let's look more closely at a T cell receptor. So again, it's a membrane-bound protein. So here this is the protein, and it's attached to the T cell's cell membrane here. There's part of the T cell receptor that is outside of the cell, and there's a part of the T cell receptor that is inside of the cell. Right? The most important part of the T cell receptor is at the very end, outside of the cell, there's an antigen binding site. So this part of the protein will only stick to the specific antigen that the T cell learned about from the APC. So if an antigen sticks here, what happens next? Right? So if an antigen binds to that antigen binding site, the T cell receptor stimulates T cell activity. So binding of the antigen to this site sends a signal through the protein into the cytoplasm of the T cell, telling the T cell, hey, you found the antigen. That means you found this dangerous thing, the pathogen. And so you should do something in response. The question becomes, well, what do T cells do when they find the antigen they've been trained to recognize? So we've gone through several steps, right? We know that T cells learn to recognize a specific antigen from an APC. We know that the T cell then has this antigen, this T cell receptor that detects the antigen in its membrane. And when it binds the antigen, it stimulates the cell to perform a function. So what are the possible functions? That depends on the exact type of T cell that we're talking about. So for our class, we're going to focus on three main types of T cells. We're going to give them different names. We'll call them cytotoxic T cells. That's one type. We'll think about some helper T cells, specifically helper 1 T cells. And then we'll think about helper 2 T cells as well. So cytotoxic T cells, and then two kinds of helper T cells. So again, what a T cell does when it detects the antigen depends on what type of T cell it is. So let's start with these cytotoxic T cells and think about what cytotoxic T cells do when they detect the antigen. So a cytotoxic T cell's job is to try to directly kill the pathogen associated with that antigen when the antigen binds their T cell receptor. So the antigen sticks to the T cell receptor, that tells the cell to do something, and the cell is going to try to kill the thing that it found. The way they do that is they release these things called cytotoxic chemicals. Basically, from their cytoplasm, they expel cytotoxic chemicals that will damage that pathogen or antigen. So that's the role of cytotoxic T cells. How about the helper 1 T cells? So helper 1 T cells try to indirectly kill pathogens. So again, when a antigen binds to the helper 1 T cell's T cell receptor, it activates the T cell to indirectly kill a pathogen. So what does that mean? How do you indirectly kill something? In this case, it means that this T cell, the helper 1 T cell, is going to release chemicals into the environment that signal for other white blood cells to come over and kill the thing it found. So signaling chemicals are released. Those chemicals recruit other white blood cells, phagocytes, cytotoxic T cells, all sorts of cells will come, and those will kill the pathogen, right? So helper 1 T cells send out signals for help. So we've got cytotoxic T cells that try to kill the pathogen directly, helper 1 T cells that signal for help so the pathogen can be killed, and then we've got these helper 2 T cells. Helper 2 T cells are really, really important. So what do? When a helper 2 T cell has its T cell receptor attached to an antigen, it uses that antigen to train B cells how to do their job. So helper 2 T cells activate B cells when the T cell has an antigen. We'll talk about B cells in a separate video and think about why they need the help of this T cell to do their job. But without helper 2 T cells, B cells can never learn to do their job. All right, so these are the types of T cells we really want to focus on for our class. And these are the names I will use for the T cells when in our discussions and on our class exams. But I want to point out to you that T cells and immune cells in general are extraordinarily complex. So we have simplified in hopes of making understanding this process a little easier. None of the names on this slide are going to be important for our class, but I just want to point out to you the diversity and complexity of T cell types. So T cells go by lots of names. You might see CD4 plus T cells. That's another way of referring to helper T cells. But that's not where CD4 plus T cell types or helper T cell types end. There are also all sorts of subtypes, Th1, Th2, Th17, etc. Again, the role of helper T cells or the roles of T cells are really specific, and there are actually lots of different types. We're simplifying in this class. There are also CD8 plus T cells. These are the cytotoxic T cells. Again, they go by other names. We're just going to call them cytotoxic T cells. There are also all sorts of other T cells. There are memory T cells that we're not discussing in this class. There are subtypes of memory T cells that, again, we're not discussing in this class. There are even more types of T cells, regulatory T cells, innate-like T cells, etc., etc., etc. We're not discussing those in this class either. I just want to point out this complexity so that you're not overwhelmed if you see those names. Let's focus on helper T cells and cytotoxic T cells. So again, let's focus on the T cell basics. We know that T cells have to be activated by APCs so that they can function. We know that T cells use T cell receptors to detect an antigen. We know that when T cells detect an antigen, they do things. What they do depends on their basic type or function. And we've got the cytotoxic T cells that try to kill the thing, helper T cells that call for help from other immune cells, and then helper 2 T cells that train B cells to do their job. And we know that T cells are required for B cells to function. Specifically, those helper 2 T cells activate B cells. Without T cell function, B cells cannot work. So let's keep those basic details in mind as we try to understand how all of these immune cells work together to protect us from potentially harmful pathogens. So we'll end there. As always, if you have questions, please let me know, and I will look forward to talking to you all again very soon.